They called him Ashfall, the wild giant no one dared to touch. For months, the stallion haunted the Oregon Valley, untamed, unbroken, a living shadow of storms and scars. But when a broken farmer with nothing left stepped forward, the world held its breath. This isn't just the story of a man saving a horse. It's the story of how a horse saved a man, and why an open gate can change everything. The dawn came cold and brittle across the Steens, the kind of morning when the sagebrush seemed dusted with frost and every sound carried far. Out in the wide valley, where the land stretched in long ribs of gray and gold, the townspeople of Burns gathered in a loose half-circle, their boots crunching the frozen ground. They spoke in low voices, eyes fixed on the giant stallion standing motionless at the meadow's edge. Ashfall. That was the name they had given him, whispered first like a warning, then repeated like a legend. A massive dun-colored horse, scar slashed across his shoulder, taller than any domestic stock, and wilder than the wind that whipped the ridges. He had broken free months earlier from a bureau corral, tearing through wire as if it were string. Since then, he had led his band of mustangs across ranch land and riverbed, appearing and vanishing like smoke. No one dared approach. Not after the broken fences, not after the cattle spooked, not after the wreck on Route 205, when his shadow rose out of the sage like a storm. This morning he stood still, steam rising from his nostrils, his dark eyes restless. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke drifting down from the mountains. Last summer's fires still haunted the land. Mothers held their children close, ranch hands muttered about danger and dollars, and the sheriff's truck idled at the far end of the line. Everyone expected the stallion to bolt, but it wasn't the horse that moved. It was the man. Caleb Hart stepped forward, leaving the murmurs behind him. He wore a coat the color of old canvas, boots cracked from years of use, and a hat that had once belonged to his father. His face was lined with grief more than age, his hands scarred and rough, the nails blackened with earth that no longer yielded crop. People in town knew him. Some pitied, some avoided. Few truly cared. He was the farmer who had lost nearly everything when the fire swept through Alvord, the man who carried silence heavier than debt. Now he walked toward Ashfall, one slow step at a time, the crunch of his boots the only sound. He did not shout, did not lift a rope, did not raise his arms. He simply breathed, each exhale steady in the chill air. The stallion's ears flicked forward, muscles taut as bowstring. For a heartbeat, it seemed the world held still. No wind, no cough from the crowd, no engine hum. Just the faint creak of leather as Caleb's hand brushed against the side of his coat, empty of tools, empty of threat. The distance closed. 10 yards. 5. Caleb could feel the heat rolling off the horse. Even from there, a pulse of wild life that made his chest ache. Ashfall's hooves shifted once, carving half-moon prints in the frozen ground. But he did not flee. He watched. He measured. He weighed. Caleb whispered, though no one else could hear. Easy, boy. Easy. And then the spell broke. The sheriff barked something, an order, a warning, Caleb could not tell. The sound carried sharp across the field. Ashfall tossed his head, mane whipping silver in the pale sun, and in a rush of power he was gone, hooves thundering across the valley floor. Dust and frost rose in his wake, blinding for a moment, and then he was nothing but a moving shadow against the ridges. The crowd exhaled as if waking from a dream. Some cursed, others muttered about danger. But Caleb stood still, eyes locked on the horizon where the stallion vanished. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt his chest fill with something not heavy, but alive. Behind him, a rancher said bitterly, "That horse'll be the ruin of someone yet." Caleb turned his head just enough for the words to drift into the cold. "Maybe," he answered, voice rough, almost breaking. "Or maybe he's the only thing left worth saving." And with that, he walked back through the crowd, silence following him like a long shadow, carrying in his chest a spark he hadn't known still burned. He carried the morning's chill home with him, the way a man carries news he isn't ready to say aloud. The gravel road to the Hart place ran straight as a ruler, and then broke, like the land itself had thought better of running toward a future. Sagebrush gave way to stubble, to bare dirt, to a scatter of blackened posts leaning like tired men. The barn that had once glowed red in twilight now wore a skin of ash-dulled gray. Window panes reflected only sky because there was little left inside them worth reflecting. Caleb parked the old pickup beside the pump that hadn't drawn clean water since summer. The handle was cold and stubborn. He leaned his weight into it until rust squealed in protest. A cough of brown water came up, then clearer, then a thin, steady stream. He watched it for a while, palm under the trickle, as if the temperature might tell him something about the day that the light did not. When he shut the pump off, the echo fell back into the earth. The house smelled faintly of mouse and sawdust. Every board he'd replaced after the fire had its own color, pale rectangles among the smoke-dark walls, like patches on a good shirt made decent again. On the kitchen table sat an envelope with the bank's printed return address, a second with the insurer's polite logo, and a third that had no logo at all, just his name in the tidy ink of a woman in an office who had never met him and never would. He stacked them without opening a single one. It wasn't that he was avoiding debt, renewal notices, time-sensitive offers on home insurance, and adjusted mortgage rates, or the card, promising low APR if he would just trust again. It was that the words inside were all versions of the same sentence, "Sir, the world moves on without you." He made coffee on the old propane stove and drank it standing up. Steam rose into the kitchen's cold, like a thought he might have had, if he could remember how. Outside, the wind came in steady threads off the stains. In the distance, a gate clicked against its hinge, a small, faithful sound. He followed it to the pasture that had been pasture when pasture meant something. The soil there was sandy and hard, tattooed with last spring's hooves now gone. He knelt and pressed his fingers into it anyway. The ground did not give. Some part of him understood the insult and did not take it personally. On the fence line, he found the section he kept promising to mend. The cedar posts were old growth, hand-cut by his father in a time when taking a tree meant planting 2 more because a man expected to outlive both. He set a new rail, hammered a pair of bent nails straight, and drove them in. The work steadied him the way a level steadies a line. A hawk circled overhead. Its shadow moved across the dust like a slow second hand. Later, he walked to the barn. The sliding door scraped a groove at his feet, a scar that had deepened each time he'd opened it since the fire. Inside, the light came thin through the cracked roof and lay in slanted bars across the dirt. The stalls were clean but empty, the way a personal history can look tidy after you've swept it of living things. He ran his hand along the top rail of the first stall and felt where two horses had once worn a small shine into the wood with their necks. He remembered their smell, grass and sun and the faint sweetness of liniment, and the way Lena used to laugh when the mare nuzzled the pocket where she kept peppermints. He remembered other sounds, too. Summer rain on tin, feed rattling in the bucket, Lena's radio on Saturday mornings playing old country songs that had learned the trick of sounding hopeful about sadness. He found the bridle he hadn't sold. The leather had dried, and he oiled it slowly, giving it back what it had given him. The bit flashed dull in the light. He wrapped it in cloth and set it aside with care, as if the act itself were prayer. On a nail above the tack room door hung his father's hat, too big for him as a boy, too empty for him now. He put it on briefly, felt the brim pull the world in closer, then hung it back up. On the drive that cut behind the barn, the mailbox waited with a patience that was either noble or foolish. He collected the mail and leafed through it in the yard. Seed catalogs with glossy fields that looked like promises, a flyer for auto insurance that swore safety could be bought in 6-month intervals, a trifold for the hardware store announcing spring deals in winter because hope sells better before it has to prove itself. He tried to picture this land green again. Alfalfa kneeling to the wind, irrigation water turning like a prayer wheel. The imagination is a muscle. His had grown thin. Still he stood there and asked it to lift something. In town he worked part-time at Weaver Feed and Supply, a job stitched together from kindness and need. He went in for the afternoon shift because the stores hum, scoops in metal bins, talk across the counter, the bell at the door, felt like a heartbeat he could borrow when his own was out of rhythm. Weaver, whose mustache made every word look heavier, nodded toward the back. 2 pallets of range cubes for Collins, he said. Road crews, not cattle. Don't ask. Caleb didn't. They moved the bags together by rote and breath, the body's old arithmetic. Lift, turn, stack, step. Outside, a pickup idled, Rhett Collins leaning on the hood with a look that could be swagger if you squinted, or fatigue if you didn't. He gave Caleb a nod that had sharp edges. You were out there this morning, Rhett said. Not a question. You and half of Harney County. I was there, Caleb answered. You get a good look? Good enough. Rhett's smile didn't reach the place where real smiles go. That horse is a headline. People pay for headlines. Some folks pay more to stop them. He tapped the side of the truck, a hollow sound in a hollow day. You ever get tired of fences that don't hold? Come talk to me. We're hiring. Government contracts, steady pay, cloud computing this, data recovery that. Hell, even the ranchers are ordering online now. I've got work, Caleb said, and felt how small the words were. Suit yourself. Rhett flicked ash from a cigarette he wasn't smoking. Just remember, things that run free tend to run right over you if you stand in the wrong place. Caleb went back inside, where Weaver pretended to be busy with invoices that didn't need his attention until they did. By closing, the sky had traded its pale noon for a hard, clean blue. He drove home in a river of light that pooled in the road's low spots and gathered under the cottonwoods like water should. At the edge of his property he stopped and turned off the engine to listen. The quiet came in layers, the after-tick of the cooling motor, the far thrum of a semi on 205, a single cow somewhere, calling to a calf that would answer when it wanted to. Underneath everything was the land, which did not speak, which only held what you put into it or let go. He walked the north fence at dusk. A coyote slipped between the sage and barley stubble, gray on gray. The first star rose where the mountain's shoulder gave way to sky. He reached the far corner and stood facing the dark. He tried the words out loud then, to see if they still fit in a mouth. Maybe he's the only thing left worth saving. In the open air, the sentence sounded less like a declaration and more like a vow made softly, so no one else would have to hold him to it. Inside, he warmed a can of soup and ate, it with bread that remembered yesterday better than he did. He set the unpaid envelopes beside his plate and opened the one with his name in tidy ink. "Final notice," it said without anger. He folded it in half and put it back in the envelope because he wasn't ready to make anything final. He took from a drawer the journal he had carried to the fire line and back. He wrote a single line. Saw ash fall at daybreak. Looked like a piece of mountain that hadn't learned how to stop moving. He closed the book. Sometimes at night, the electricity blinked and stayed. Tonight, it held. He turned on the porch light and sat on the top step, hands around a mug that had cooled past usefulness, watching the yard fade to dark. Wind pressed old leaves against the stoop and let them go. The air had that thin metallic scent it gets when distant places are burning. No smoke here, not yet, but the idea of smoke. He remembered Lena's last summer, how she'd stitched a bright patch onto his work shirt where the cuff had torn, how she'd taped a note to the mirror that read, "You can't fix the weather, but you can fix your coffee." He smiled at that, small and sideways, and then the smile was gone like a quail startled from a bush. A pair of headlights drifted along the county road and disappeared. The night closed the gap. He watched until it was only him and the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breath. Out beyond the fence, something moved, a shape against shape, taller than a man, stiller than fear. His body stood before he told it to. He didn't step off the porch. He didn't call out. It might have been a juniper playing at horse under the starlight, or a horse playing at juniper. Either way, it held him. When the shape was gone, if it had been there at all, he went inside, locked a door nobody wanted to open, and lay down in a bed that had learned his weight and his absence both. Sleep came like the tide after a long wind, not all at once, but in patient, convincing waves. He woke before dawn, the house cool on his skin, a thin seam of light at the curtain's edge. Coffee, boots, hat. He took an apple from the bowl on the counter and cut it into quarters he could hold open on a flat hand. Then he stood in the doorway and breathed once, long, as if the whole day depended on that breath turning him into the kind of man who could take another step. The road into town would spool out the way it always did, past the Mitchell's place, past the hardware store, with the neon that never turned off, past the sign for life insurance that claimed tomorrow could be protected by a signature. But first, he would take the path along the fence where the soil remembered hooves. He would go to the rise from which you could see the highway cut the valley like a scar that would not heal. He would look for a piece of mountain that hadn't learned how to stop moving. And if, later that day, Route 205 drew a story to itself, if steel met shadow, and men met, the limits of what they could control, He would be there to read it, to answer if the page turned his way, to step in if stepping in was what kept the story from closing too soon. Because a man who has lost almost everything he can name sometimes finds what's left in the space just before trouble, in the breath that keeps him between running and staying. Caleb set the apple quarters in his coat pocket, shut the door, and walked into the morning that was already choosing him. He did not know yet that the highway would lay out its hard questions by noon, or that a young vet with steady hands and a boy with a phone would be waiting at the edge of those questions. He did not know yet that another look would pass between him and the dun-colored giant, and that the next time the world might not cough an order at the wrong moment. But he knew this. The fields might be dead, and the bank might send its letters, and the barn might always carry the smell of yesterday, but there was still a path to the place where the valley widened and the road bent. He took it, letting the cold air polish his lungs, letting the horizon put a straightener to his spine, walking toward whatever the day meant to ask of him. And just before the light broke clean over the ridge, he said aloud to no one, "Easy, boy. Easy," as if the morning itself were a skittish animal that might decide to stand its ground. The noon sun burned pale over Route 205, a light that carried no warmth. The road shimmered, its black top holding the memory of 1,000 heavy tires. Caleb was already there, leaning against his old truck, arms folded, the apple quarters from dawn long since eaten. He had come to watch the valley breathe, to feel again that edge where the wild sometimes crossed into the ordered. Then the valley answered. A low thunder rose, not from the sky, but from the ground itself. Ashfall burst from the sage, muscles coiled, mane dark as storm clouds. Dust erupted under his hooves. Behind him, a scatter of smaller mustangs streaked across the open stretch, their shadows lengthening across the road. A freight truck bore down from the north, horn blaring, brakes screaming. The world slammed into one moment, the horse that refused to yield, the machine that could not stop. The stallion cleared the highway in a leap so fierce it seemed to tear silence itself. The band followed, wild eyes reflecting sunlight. Tires smoked, rubber burned sharp into the air. The truck skidded, missed by yards. Men in the cab shouted curses that no one heard, because everyone's eyes were fixed on the place where Ashfall landed, solid and whole, dust rising around him like incense. On the opposite shoulder stood a woman in jeans, hair pulled back, hands clenched around a vet's kit. June Miller. She had been driving her old horse trailer when the first Mustang bolted across. She was already kneeling, breath short, at the side of a foal caught in a strip of barbed wire that ran along the fence. Blood wasn't much, but the wire cut deep. Caleb crossed before he knew he was moving, knelt opposite her, and together they worked in silence that was louder than any siren. "Hold him steady," June said, her voice calm in the storm. Caleb braced the trembling legs while she cut the wire with pliers pulled from her kit. The foal's chest heaved, eyes wide, but when the last strand fell, it stilled, trembling into Caleb's grip. He stroked the neck gently, whispering the same words he had whispered to the morning. "Easy, boy, easy." From the roadside ditch, another sound rose, a click, then a digital chime. A teenager, skinny frame in an oversized hoodie, crouched with a phone aimed straight at the scene. Aidan Cole. His camera trembled, but he did not look away. His live stream captured everything. The foal freed, the dun stallion turning back once to look, and the farmer and the vet kneeling in the dust like figures pulled from some older story. The video raced online before the dust even settled. Comments scrolled faster than Aiden could read. Wild horse of Oregon. Insurance claims waiting to happen. That man's crazy, that woman's brave. Algorithms pulled it into feeds across the state. In Burns, in Portland, in boardrooms where auto insurance and personal injury attorneys calculated risk, Ashfall became more than a horse. He became a question. By the time the sheriff's cruiser arrived, lights spinning red in the pale day, the road had filled with voices, truckers cursing, ranchers shaking heads, June binding the foal's leg, Caleb standing silent, dust still clinging to his coat. Sheriff Daniels took one long look and muttered, "That horse is going to bankrupt somebody." Caleb didn't answer. His eyes were on the ridge where Ashfall vanished, mane streaming, the band at his heels. Something inside him shifted again. He had seen the stallion choose not just flight, but return, turning his head back toward them, as if measuring not fear, but recognition. June touched his sleeve. "You held steady," she said, not looking at him, but at the foal now leaning against its mother. "Most men don't." He could have told her he hadn't held steady for Lena, not in the moment when steady mattered most, but the words stayed locked behind his teeth. He only nodded once, the brim of his hat shading eyes that suddenly stung. Aiden lowered his phone. "Mister, I think the whole county just saw you on TikTok." His grin was nervous, hopeful. "Maybe the whole country." Caleb blinked at the boy, unsure what a hashtag was worth in a world where fences still broke and fires still came. But in Aiden's eyes was something he hadn't seen in years. Belief, untested, but fierce. The sheriff barked orders, men dragged wire off the asphalt, and traffic grudgingly began to flow again. June loaded her kit back into the trailer, the foal limping but alive. Aiden pocketed his phone, already composing captions that would shape how strangers far away understood this valley. Caleb stood in the road a moment longer. The tar still smelled of burned rubber, the dust still floated in the air. He looked where Ashfall had leapt, the arc still visible in his mind, and he whispered to no one but himself, "Maybe ruin isn't the only thing he'll bring." As he turned back toward his truck, June's voice followed him softly. "If you're going after him, you won't do it alone." And the road, still carrying the echo of hooves, seemed to agree. The words followed him for days. "If you're going after him, you won't do it alone." June had spoken them like a promise she wasn't sure she meant to keep, yet they clung to Caleb as firmly as dust on his boots. He turned them over while fixing fence rails, while filling water troughs that sat unused, while standing in a barn too clean of hoof prints. He knew better than to chase a horse like Ashfall, but knowing better had never stopped him from carrying a weight he couldn't set down. It was Eli Redbird who gave the words, shape. Caleb found the old man at his workshop on the north edge of town, where leather smelled of oil and smoke, and half-finished saddles rested like relics on their stands. Eli was from people who remembered horses long before corrals, people who believed wind had a language worth listening to. His hair was silver-braided, his hands slow but steady, his eyes sharp as mountain light. Caleb had come with no plan, only a restlessness that had turned into a question he couldn't quite say. Eli didn't wait for the words. He lifted a bridle, turned it in the light, and said, "That horse doesn't need catching. He needs understanding. You've lost something too, or you wouldn't be asking." Caleb said nothing. His silence was enough. The old man gestured toward the valley. You want him to come close? You stop acting like a hunter. Sit with your back to the wind. Lower your shoulders. Breathe like you mean to live. The horse will know. Caleb tried it first on his own land. He sat in the pasture where no horses grazed anymore, hat tilted low, eyes half closed. The wind pressed sage against his skin, carried the smell of dust and the faint, bitter memory of fire. He breathed in and out until his chest loosened. At first, nothing changed. Then a raven dipped low, settling on a fence post, head cocked. He thought of Eli's words. The land watches how you wait. A week later, he took an apple and walked to the ridge where Route 205 bent toward the mountains. He placed the fruit in the grass and sat down 20 yards away, hands resting open on his knees. Hours passed. Shadows stretched. His legs stiffened. And then, faint as a thought, movement rippled in the sage. Ashfall emerged, head high, eyes dark with suspicion. He circled, tested the air, retreated, advanced again. The apple vanished between his teeth. Dust scattered as he turned back to the hills. Caleb remained still, hardly breathing, but inside his ribs something had shifted. The next day he returned with another apple, and another the day after that. He learned patience in ways the fire had burned out of him. He learned the rhythm of waiting, how to steady his breath when the stallion's ears flicked, how to let silence carry meaning heavier than any rope. On the fourth day, Ashfall stopped halfway, lifted his head, and stared directly at him. Their eyes held. A wild heartbeat stretched across the meadow. The horse snorted once, pawed the earth, and vanished. But Caleb knew he had been seen. June came one evening, her truck rumbling up his drive. She leaned against the porch rail, arms folded, the smell of iodine and hay clinging to her. You're feeding him apples, Caleb shrugged. Only what he'll take. You think that'll tame him? No, Caleb said, his voice rough but steady. I don't want him tamed. I want him to choose. She studied him for a long time, then smiled faintly. That's a dangerous kind of hope. Later, Caleb wrote in his journal, Wind carries more than weather. It carries a language. If I'm quiet enough, maybe I'll learn to speak it. He closed the book, listening to the night settle around the barn, the sound of crickets weaving through the dark. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, a stallion carried his own silence, and maybe, just maybe, it was beginning to answer. The days grew longer, light stretching thin over the valley, as though time itself wanted to linger. Caleb began carrying apples in his coat pocket, quartered carefully each morning with the same knife his father had once used to cut twine. The ritual steadied him. He would walk to the same meadow, sit with his back to the wind, and place the fruit in a line that shortened the distance between him and the stallion. Ashfall appeared like a rumor becoming flesh. At first he stayed at the far edge, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. But hunger and curiosity are patient forces. One by one, the apples disappeared, hooves stamping softly in the grass. Caleb never moved. He kept his gaze lowered, hands open on his knees, his breath slow. It was not taming. It was not training. It was simply waiting with enough faith to let silence carry its own meaning. On the third evening, Ashfall stopped at the last piece, a slice no more than 20 feet away. He raised his head, eyes locking with Caleb's, the air between them taut as wire. Neither moved. Neither surrendered. The stallion pawed the ground once, then swallowed the apple, dust rising faintly in the twilight. Caleb released the breath he had been holding for what felt like years. He did not smile. He only let his shoulders drop, his body speaking the language Eli had taught him. The meadow became a place of unspoken lessons. Rabbits darted between sage clumps, quail lifted suddenly at dusk, and once a coyote padded along the ridge, its eyes reflecting the last light. Caleb noticed it all now. He had trained his senses to listen for what wasn't said. In that quiet, he began hearing the echo of his own grief, less sharply. The fire's memory loosened its grip, just enough for the air to taste cleaner. June came by one afternoon, her truck door slamming into the stillness. She watched from a distance as ashfall circled the apple pieces, her face a study in disbelief. When Caleb returned to the oak where she leaned, dust on his coat and patience in his bones, she said, "Most people would have tried a rope by now." He shook his head. A rope would only remind him of cages. Then what are you hoping for? That he chooses to come close, Caleb said simply. She didn't argue. She only nodded, as though the answer was less about horses and more about the man who spoke it. By the week's end, Ashfall's visits had grown steadier. He came at dawn, at dusk, sometimes in the still blue hour before the sun touched the sage. Caleb no longer wondered if the stallion would appear. He wondered only how far he would come. He sketched the horse in his journal, lines rough but true, capturing the slope of the neck, the jagged scar across the shoulder, the way the mane seemed to carry stormlight. He added no words, because words would only cheapen what the silence had given him. The breakthrough came at sunset. Caleb placed the apple slices as usual, then sat back against the oak. Ashfall followed the trail until the last piece lay almost within reach of the man's boots. Dust floated in the golden air. The stallion lowered his head, lips brushing fruit, eyes never leaving Caleb's. For a heartbeat, the distance between man and horse collapsed into something fragile, but real. Then Ashfall snorted, spun, and vanished into the trees. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and laughed once. A dry, cracked sound, but alive. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't conquest. It was recognition, a thread drawn between two wounded creatures who had decided, if only for a moment, not to run. That night, as he sat on his porch, the stars came out one by one like nails hammered into black wood. He thought of Lena, of the fire, of all he had not been able to hold. And then he thought of Ashfall's eyes, steady on him across the grass. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine tomorrow, not as a burden, but as a door left half open. The town hall in Burns smelled of dust, coffee left too long on a hot plate, and the faint tang of old wood polished more by hands than by care. The folding chairs had been set in crooked rows, a flag leaned in the corner, and the murmur of voices carried a tension that needed no introduction. Caleb sat at the back, hat low, hands folded, trying to look like a man who had only come for warmth. But he was there for the stallion, though no one needed to ask. At the front, Marjorie Kane stood with papers in hand, her voice clipped and efficient. The Department of Transportation has approved partial funding. To prevent accidents on 205, we'll be contracting new fencing along the northern stretch. It will keep wildlife off the road. It will protect property. It will save lives. She didn't have to mention Ashfall. The shadow of the horse was already in the room. Rhett Collins leaned against the wall near the door, arms folded, a smile too casual to be anything but planned. "I've already submitted a bid. Steel posts, barbed top, strong enough to turn even the big one back to where he belongs. A job worth doing and worth paying for." His voice had that rodeo edge, half challenge, half showmanship. A murmur rose among the ranchers. Some nodded, others frowned. They'd lost sleep worrying about the stallion leading mares out of their corrals, about insurance hikes, about the next wreck on the highway that might not end with just smoke and curses. Caleb felt each word press against him like wire against skin. He thought of the apple slices, of the way Ashfall had lowered his head and looked at him across the meadow. He thought of silence and choice, of the fragile thread spun between them. And now here, in a room that smelled of stale promises, the thread was being cut before it could hold. When the floor opened for comments, Caleb stood. The scrape of his chair was louder than his voice at first. "A fence won't stop him. It'll only hurt him." Heads turned. The sheriff frowned. Marjorie raised her brows. Rhett smirked. Caleb kept speaking anyway. "That horse doesn't need more wire. He needs a way through. You fence him in. He'll find a way over, or die trying. And then you'll have your headlines, but they'll read different than you planned." Silence met him, thick as dust. Then Rhett chuckled. "Hart, you couldn't keep your own fences up when you had stock. What makes you an expert now?" Caleb didn't answer. He lowered his gaze, sat back down, and let the weight of his words hang where it might. But inside, the fire that had burned his land still smoldered. He would not let another cage decide the stallion's fate. After the meeting, June found him outside, leaning against the bed of his truck. The air smelled of sage and exhaust, the sky painted with the last light of day. "You spoke truth in there," she said quietly. "Doesn't mean they'll listen." "They'll listen when it costs them more not to," Caleb muttered. She studied him, the lines on his face, the wear in his shoulders. "You're not doing this just for him." Caleb looked away. "Maybe I am. Maybe I'm doing it for everything I couldn't save." On the drive home, headlights passing on the highway, he imagined the gleam of Ashfall's eyes in the dark hills. Wire, contracts, men with hammers and reasons. It was all closing in. And yet he felt a resolve take root. If the valley was going to lay a fence across freedom, then he would find the gap, or make one. The wind rattled the loose tin on his barn roof when he pulled into the yard. He stood in the stillness for a long while, looking at the land that had once fed him, at the emptiness that had once been filled with hooves and breath. The bank's letters waited on the table inside. The pasture waited too, wide and silent, as though it remembered something he did not. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Ashfall lifted his head into the same wind, sensing the change, the wire that had not yet been stretched but already sang its warning. The valley smelled of thawing earth, sage, and the sharp tang of melted snow rolling off the steens. Caleb had been walking the old cattle trail for days, boots cutting the same line through dust and rock, studying where the earth dipped and where the grass grew thickest. The plan was not grand. It was quiet, like the man himself. A path made soft enough that even the most wary creature might choose to walk it. Eli Redbird came with him, his steps slower now but steady. He carried a staff of juniper polished smooth by years of hands. "This way was used long before fences," he said, tapping the ground where ancient hoof prints had worn faint grooves. "Wild things remember better than people do." Caleb nodded. He didn't say how much he needed to believe that. At dusk, he laid out the offering. Salt blocks broken into smaller pieces, a scatter of cut hay borrowed from Weaver's store, and 2 apples quartered, their scent drifting sweet in the cooling air. He set them in a line that led through the narrow cut of rock, opening into meadowland beyond. It was not a trap. It was an invitation. They waited. The wind shifted. Shadows lengthened. And then, as if the mountain had breathed, Ashfall appeared at the edge of the clearing. His body carried power coiled tight, mane whipping as he tested the air. Behind him, mares and younger horses clustered, their ears flicking, eyes catching the last light. Caleb sat on a boulder, hands loose, spine bowed in patience. He did not move as Ashfall advanced, slow, cautious. The stallion paused at each marker, tasting salt, crunching hay, sniffing at the apple slices. Step by step, the line shortened. Eli whispered, "He's listening." Caleb exhaled, steady. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might shake the stone beneath him. But he did not break the stillness. Ashfall reached the last slice, mere yards from where Caleb sat. For a moment the world was nothing but breath and silence. The stallion lowered his head, teeth closing around the fruit, eyes fixed on the man who offered nothing more than space. Caleb's hand twitched once, then stilled. Trust was too fragile to grasp. And then it happened. Ashfall shifted, not away but forward, a step that closed the space between wild and waiting. His muzzle brushed the grass so close to Caleb's boots that he could feel the warmth of breath rising. The air carried the smell of earth, sweat, and something electric, freedom itself, alive and trembling. Caleb lowered his voice, hardly more Hanan than air. "Easy, boy." The stallion snorted softly, not in alarm, but in recognition. The mares behind him relaxed, heads dipping. For the first time, the band followed their leader into the meadow Caleb had marked. They moved past him, hooves drumming, manes streaming in twilight. Ashfall lingered last, eyes locking once more with Caleb's, before he too crossed into the open grass. Eli placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You gave them choice. That's why they came." Caleb swallowed hard, the ache in his chest almost too much to hold. He had not won anything. He had not claimed. But in that fragile passage, he felt something shift inside him, the way a locked door sometimes clicks open without warning. When night fell, the stars glimmered sharp and cold. Caleb sat alone after Eli left, listening to the band graze in the dark meadow. He thought of Lena, of all the times he had failed to act, failed to move. Tonight, he had not forced, had not caged. He had only opened a path. And for once, something had chosen to walk with him. The sound of hooves moved like a heartbeat through the grass, steady, unafraid. Caleb closed his eyes and let it carry him into a sleep softer than he had known in years. The wind turned restless that week, rattling tin roofs in town and carrying the dry scent of sage through every open door. Caleb felt it in his bones, the shift of weather that often came before trouble. He spent long evenings at the meadow's edge, watching Ashfall's band move through the grass with a calm he had never seen before. The stallion's trust was still fragile, but it was there, woven through small moments, through the way Ashfall no longer bolted at the sight of him, through the steady rhythm of hooves near his campfire. But trouble had its own patience. Rhett Collins had been watching too. The rodeo man turned contractor had grown restless with talk in town that Caleb Hart had somehow done what no one else could, stood close to the wild horse without rope or steel. Rhett didn't like losing ground, not to a man who worked part-time at a feed store, not to whispers that respect had shifted. He had a contract for fencing in his pocket, and pride burning in his chest. To him, Ashfall wasn't a creature worth understanding. He was a headline waiting to be caught, a trophy to prove a point. One morning, Caleb followed the trail down to the narrows where basalt walls rose on either side. He paused. Something felt wrong. The air carried the faint metallic clink of chain, the smell of oil that didn't belong to meadow or horse. He crouched low and found it. A line of woven netting stretched between hidden posts, camouflaged with brush. Steel stakes held it taut, and a length of barbed wire glittered faintly in the sun. It wasn't meant for cattle. It was meant for Ashfall. Caleb's stomach turned. He pulled the netting with his hands, testing its bite. It would hold long enough to tangle hooves, to panic a band into breaking, bones against each other. His breath came sharp. He looked around for signs of who had done it, but already knew. Rhett's shadow was in every knot, every careless smear of boot print in the dust. That evening, the trap sang its warning in the wind. The brush shifted, rattled, and Caleb heard the faintest thud of hooves approaching. He ran, stumbling over stone, waving his arms, shouting until his voice tore. The band spooked at his sudden noise, wheeling away in confusion. But one young colt, not yet practiced in the language of escape, stumbled into the loose edge of the net. The wire wrapped around a slender leg, and the foal screamed, a sound that ripped through the valley like a wound. Ashfall reared, hooves slicing the air, eyes wide with fury. The band surged, dust rising in a choking cloud. Caleb dove to the colt's side, hands raw as he fought the wire, cutting it away with the same pocket knife that had sliced apples. The foal trembled against him, sweat slick, eyes rolling white. At last, the last strand snapped, and the young horse limped free, vanishing into the dust. When the cloud settled, Ashfall was gone. He had taken the band back into the hills, leaving Caleb kneeling in the dirt, hands bleeding, chest heaving. The meadow that had once felt like a place of quiet communion now pulsed with betrayal. Caleb knew the stallion had seen the wire, had smelled the human stink of it, had watched a man near enough to the trap to look guilty. He stood, chest burning, and shouted into the wind, "It wasn't me!" But the only answer was the hiss of sage and the scrape of brush in the trap he hadn't set. That night, Caleb couldn't sit still. He paced the porch until the boards groaned, lit the lantern, put it out again, then walked the fence lines with his hands shoved deep in his coat. When he tried to sleep, images chased him. The stallion's eyes, wide with mistrust, the colt's scream, the dust cloud swallowing everything he had tried to build. By dawn, his resolve had hardened. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. It was about the fight for a kind of truth the valley wanted to forget. That wild things had a right to choose their own way, and that men like Rhett, with their contracts and wire, were only building prisons dressed up as safety. He returned to the narrows and tore at the trap until his fingers split. He cut every knot, pulled every stake, rolled the netting into a heap of twisted wire, and set it alight. The smoke curled into the morning sky, bitter and black, carrying a message Rhett would not miss. The flames hissed as the wind shifted, carrying sparks into the brush. Caleb stamped them out with his boots, chest heaving, sweat mixing with dust. When the last wire had melted into silence, he stood alone, the valley stretching wide and empty around him. But emptiness was not the same as peace. Somewhere beyond sight, Ashfall was watching, carrying a memory of betrayal that Caleb had not earned but could not deny. The thread between them had frayed to nearly nothing. As he walked back toward home, the wind followed, restless, as if it too could sense the fragile trust unraveling. The rain came thin and gray, drifting across the valley like smoke that had forgotten its fire. Caleb stood at the broken oak near the meadow, coat soaked through, boots heavy in the mud. He had not been here since the trap, since the colt's scream and the cloud of dust that carried Ashfall away. He had torn the wire, burned the net, but fire could not erase the look in the stallion's eyes, that sharp, cutting flash of betrayal. Now the land smelled of ash again, though no blaze touched it. Memories carried their own scent, and Caleb could not walk 3 steps without breathing Lena's last day. He had replayed it too many times. The rush of flames through the grass, the roar like a freight train bearing down, the way his throat locked when she shouted his name. He had frozen. 1 heartbeat too long. When the smoke lifted, the house still stood, but the woman who filled it was gone. He pressed his palm to the rough bark, breath shallow. "I couldn't save her," he said aloud, though no one was near to hear. His voice sounded small in the wet air, swallowed by rain. "I couldn't move, not fast enough, not brave enough. And now you," he broke off, his words fraying in the wind. Beyond the trees, movement flickered. A shape, dun-hide against gray mist, stood on the ridge. Ashfall. The stallion's head was high, ears forward, mane plastered dark by rain. He did not come closer. He only watched, the distance between them wider than miles. Caleb's chest tightened until it hurt. "I didn't set that wire," Caleb whispered, rain running into his mouth. "But you don't know that. You just saw me there, and maybe that was enough. I don't blame you. I don't even trust myself." The stallion shifted, hooves sinking in soft ground, then blew through his nostrils, sharp in the damp air. Caleb dropped to his knees in the mud. It wasn't prayer, not really. It was confession given to a creature who might never understand words, but always understood truth. "I froze once," he said, voice cracking. "I froze when she needed me most. And I swore I wouldn't again. That's why I came to you. Not to own you, not to break you, just to prove to myself that I could still move when it mattered." His hands sank into the earth, mud filling the lines of his fingers. He stayed that way for a long while, head bowed, the rain washing over him as if trying to rinse away the weight of years. When he finally lifted his face, Ashfall was still there. Closer now, though still cautious, muscles taut. The stallion's eyes locked with his, and Caleb felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not trust, but recognition. The kind 2 broken things give each other across a gulf neither can cross yet. Caleb stood slowly, every movement deliberate. He raised one hand, palm open, empty. Rain dripped from his sleeve, ran off his fingers. Ashfall did not approach, but he did not turn away either. For a heartbeat, the air held the fragile echo of possibility. Then, from far down the valley, a shout cut through the rain. Men's voices, harsh, carried by the wind. Caleb's heart lurched. He knew Rhett's tone even without seeing him, and he knew what pursuit meant. Ashfall tensed, muscles quivering, then spun and vanished into the curtain of mist. The ridge stood empty once more. Caleb sagged against the oak, water streaming off the brim of his hat. His confession had not brought the stallion closer, but it had carved something open in himself. For the first time, the words had been spoken in full. He had admitted his failure, laid it bare in mud and rain, and in return, he had been given a gaze that did not turn away. That night, back at the cabin, he lit no fire. He sat in the dark, journal open, pen moving slow. I told him. I told the wind. I told the truth. It did not break me. Maybe that's enough. He closed the book, leaned his head back, and let the silence settle. Outside, the rain eased. In the distance, a horse called once, low and uncertain. Caleb's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't grief. It was something lighter, like the first breath after smoke clears. The morning after the rain, the valley smelled of wet sage and clean earth. The air carried a hush, as if the land itself waited. Caleb drove into town with mud still on his boots and confession still raw in his chest. He found June outside the feed store, sleeves rolled, loading sacks into her trailer. She studied his face a moment, then asked, "What happened out there?" I told him the truth, Caleb said simply. And he didn't run, not right away. June set the sack down gently. That's something. Her eyes narrowed, thoughtful. But Rhett won't stop. Not after the trap. If he's pushing fences, there's going to be another attempt. And next time the horse won't just mistrust you, he'll be gone for good. By afternoon, they sat around Eli Redbird's table, the old man's workshop filled with the smell of leather and pine smoke. Aidan leaned forward, elbows on the wood, phone dark for once. So we make him a way out, the boy said. Not a trap. A path, like a corridor. Something he can choose. Eli nodded slowly. A soft path. Our people laid them for centuries. Salt to draw, cloth to mark, grass cut fresh to lead the way. Not to bind, but to invite. His eyes moved to Caleb. It will take patience, and more than one pair of hands. They worked through the week. June brought old feed sacks soaked in brine, cut into strips that fluttered when tied to fence posts. Aidan scavenged bright cloth from thrift shops in town, laughing as he held up shirts no one had worn since the 70s. Eli mixed herbs into salt, a trick from his grandfather, to carry scent farther on the wind. Caleb cut hay and spread it in small patches along the chosen route, a narrow passage between basalt walls that opened into the high meadow beyond the reach of fencing crews. By dusk, the line was set. Cloth snapping gently, salt glinting in the last light, hay scattered like breadcrumbs across stone. Caleb stood at the entrance, heart pounding. He felt less like a man making a plan, and more like a man opening a door he wasn't sure he deserved to open. The band appeared as the sun bled into the horizon. First the mares, cautious, then the young ones, ears pricked. Finally Ashfall, head high, scar dark against his shoulder. The stallion tested the air, ears flicking at the rustle of cloth. Caleb held his breath as the horse stepped closer. One stride, then another. The sound of hooves echoed between the rocks, slow and deliberate. Easy, Caleb murmured, though he knew the word was more for himself. The band followed, drawn by salt and scent. Cloth fluttered like prayer flags, leading them deeper. Caleb walked a pace behind, every muscle aching with the effort of not rushing forward. June and Eli held back, silent, their presence felt but unseen. Aidan filmed, but even he lowered the phone at times, eyes wide with the gravity of what unfolded. Ashfall stopped once, midway. He turned his head, eyes finding Caleb in the half-light. For an instant, mistrust flared again, the memory of wire, of pain. Caleb lifted both hands, palms open, nothing hidden. "Your choice," he whispered. The words carried like smoke, thin but honest. The stallion's ears twitched. He snorted, pawed the earth, then pressed forward, leading the band into the meadow. Hooves thundered, dust rose, and the passage that had been empty moments before pulsed with wild life. Caleb's chest loosened, breath rushing out in a sound close to a sob. Eli placed a hand on his shoulder. "You gave him away," the old man said softly. "Now he knows the difference between a cage and a choice." The four of them stood in the fading light, watching until the band spread across the grass, grazing under the rising moon. The trail of salt and cloth lay quiet behind them, nothing more than scraps and scent, yet it had carried the weight of trust heavier than steel. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something he hadn't dared name. Hope that did not vanish with dawn. The morning broke sharp and clean, a thin frost on the sage, and a sky washed pale blue after the storm. Caleb stood at the rise above the new meadow, breath steaming, watching the band graze where basalt walls opened wide to grass. They had taken the soft path. They had chosen it. That alone should have been enough. But word traveled quickly in Harney County, and whispers carried farther than wind. By midday, the hunters came. 6 riders in dust-coated jackets, rifles slung, ropes coiled like questions waiting for an answer. Rhett Collins led them, his hat tipped low, a grin tight on his mouth. They fanned out along the ridge, eyes fixed on the band below. To them, the meadow looked like opportunity. To Caleb, it looked like a sanctuary about to be broken. He walked down before they could descend. The riders shifted uneasily as he came into view, boots steady on rock. Rhett called out, voice carrying, "Step aside, Hart. You've had your play. Now it's time for the men who know what they're doing." Caleb stopped, hands loose at his sides. "He doesn't belong to you." Rhett's laugh was sharp. "Doesn't belong to anyone, that's the problem. You think a horse that size running loose won't wreck another truck, kill another driver? Insurance won't cover it forever. Someone's got to take responsibility." Behind him, one of the younger riders muttered agreement, but another shifted uneasily, eyes on the band below. The Mustangs moved restlessly, sensing tension. Ashfall lifted his head, ears pricked, dark eyes fixed uphill where men argued. Caleb turned, facing the stallion. He did not raise his voice. "Stay with me," he murmured, though the words were carried more by breath than sound. Ashfall did not flee. He stepped forward instead, hooves crunching frost, body coiled with wild strength. The mares followed, hesitant but drawn. Caleb walked to meet them, every step deliberate, his presence a shield between the horses and the hunters. "Look at that," one man whispered. "He's walking with him." Rhett cursed, spurred his horse forward. "Smoke and mirrors. He'll bolt the minute Hart twitches wrong." But the stallion did not bolt. He matched Caleb's pace, stride for stride, until they reached the gap between riders. Caleb lifted one hand, palm outward. "Let us pass," he said, voice even, steady. For a moment, no one moved. The hunters' horses shifted, nervous at the energy in the air, as if they too understood something larger than men's plans was unfolding. Then one rider, Wilson, a cattleman with lines of weather carved into his face, reined aside, opening space. "Let them go," he muttered. Rhett wheeled on him. "You've lost your damn mind." "Maybe," Wilson said, eyes never leaving Ashfall, "but I've never seen anything like that." The gap widened. Caleb walked through it, Ashfall at his shoulder, the band flowing behind them like a river finding its channel. Dust rose under their hooves, glittering in sunlight. They did not run. They walked, steady and calm, every step a defiance of wire and rifles and fear. Behind, Rhett shouted, but his men no longer followed. Doubt cracked their resolve, and the sound of their voices faded against the rhythm of hooves. Caleb did not look back. His focus was on the stallion beside him, the wild strength contained in each breath, the fragile thread of trust holding against all odds. When they crested the far ridge, the meadow spread before them, open, wide, untouched by fence. Ashfall tossed his head, mane flaring, and released a call that echoed across the valley. The band broke into a gallop, streaming into the grass, but the stallion lingered near Caleb long enough to brush close, so near that warm breath touched the man's skin. Then he wheeled away, thundering after his herd, freedom in every stride. Caleb stood alone at the ridge, chest heaving, eyes stinging. He had not tamed the stallion, not captured him, not claimed him, but he had walked beside him, and that was enough. Behind him, the hunters gathered, silent now. Rhett's curses sounded smaller, his anger edged with something closer to fear. No one moved to follow. They had seen what they were not meant to see. A wild thing choosing to walk with a broken man, not because of rope or steel, but because of trust. Caleb turned his back on them all, walking down into the meadow, where hoofprints stitched fresh patterns into the frost. For the first time in years, his own footsteps felt steady, as if the ground itself recognized him again. The council chamber wasn't built for crowds, but crowds came anyway. Boots tracking dust across the tile, coats dripping meltwater, whispers bunching up under the low ceiling. Fluorescent lights hummed like tired bees. The flag in the corner drooped as if it, too, had heard this argument before. Caleb took a seat along the wall beside a potted fern the color of old money. He kept his hat on his lap, hands quiet. Across the aisle, June and Aidan slid in together. Eli stood near the back, leaning on his juniper staff, as if it had been holding meetings longer than the county itself. Marjorie Kane rapped the gavel once. "We'll keep this brief," she said, and the room laughed, because everyone knew brief was a word officials used when they were about to spend the evening. Her eyes were clear, voice steady, a woman measuring distance between law and the land it meant to govern. "We are here to discuss safety on Route 205 and the proposed fencing. After the incident in the high meadow," a murmur rolled the room, "we have new information to consider." New information was one way to put it. Aidan's video had gone everywhere, phones lit in diners, on tractors, at the lone barber shop where men pretended not to watch. The clip wasn't flashy. No fast cuts, no grand music. Just a man walking and a horse walking with him. The line of riders parting like a river, making room for a stone that refused to move. The sound that carried wasn't cheers. It was hooves on frost, and breath in cold air. Rhett Collins stood when the floor opened. His smile was tight and expensive. I'll be plain, he said. We can't run a county on fairy tales. A stallion that size is a lawsuit waiting to right itself. Auto insurance won't keep eating the losses. Folks are already calling their agents. You want rising premiums? You want an accident that ends in headlines we can't afford? Fence the corridor and do it right. A few heads nodded, fear finding purchase where it always did, in bills and what-ifs. Caleb heard the word premiums and felt the old ache of envelopes on his kitchen table. Home insurance blurbs, mortgage rates he would never qualify for, letters that dressed bad news in polite fonts. He kept his hands quiet. A cattleman named Wilson, quiet at the ridge yesterday, quiet now, stood with his hat crushed in one fist. I've run cows 40 years, he said. I know trouble when I see it. But I also know what I saw up there. That horse followed a man through a gap you couldn't have roped him through if you tried a week. I don't like fences that make wild things break themselves. We can do better. Like what? Someone called. Wish on it? Eli's voice threaded the room without raising. A path. He tapped his staff once, soft. Marked the way a person marks respect. Salt, cloth, grass, scent on the wind. You make the road smarter and the land kinder. Warning signs that light when bands approach. Temporary closures when they cross. You fence where you must, for cattle, for crops. But you leave a door open where the wild remembers its trail. Marjorie folded her hands. We have budget for signage, she said carefully. Adaptive beacons have brought down collisions with mule deer on 78. It wouldn't be a stretch to... Rhett cut in. Beacons don't stop 800 pounds of bone and muscle when it decides to jump a hood. June rose then, and the room leaned toward her without meaning to. She spoke like she did at the side of an animal in pain. Low, precise, no extra words. I've patched up enough wrecks to know wire doesn't save people. Thoughtless wire kills horses. We aren't debating whether to act. We're deciding how to act and still look at ourselves later. She glanced once at Caleb and then back to Marjorie. Pilot the corridor. Give it a season. Measure collisions before and after. If it fails, I'll help you string every post myself. But if it works, and I believe it will, you'll have saved money, lives, and something harder to name but easier to lose. Silence feathered the room. On the far side, Aiden cleared his throat, clutching his ball cap like a life ring. Ma'am, I'm no expert. A few chuckles, not unkind. But people watched the video because it felt possible. Not just the horse, the people. The way we didn't blow it when we could have. If you give us a corridor, we'll help keep it clear. We can organize volunteers, text chain, GPS pings, whatever. My school's shop teacher will help us build temporary gates. He swallowed. We want to help. We're from here. Rhett's mouth thinned, but even he glanced at the kid with something like calculation. Views were numbers. Numbers turned into contracts. The room wasn't with him tonight, at least not like before. Finally, Marjorie stood. The gavel stayed still. Here's what I propose. Resolution 12 to 31. We suspend the continuous fence along the northern stretch. Its place, we authorize an experimental wildlife corridor from the Narrows to the High Meadow. We install adaptive warning signs triggered by motion, funding from the transportation grant. We place seasonal gates for ranch passage, coordinate times, and publish a standing notice. We track collisions and insurance claims for 1 year. At the first sign this increases risk, we revisit. In the meantime, we impose a moratorium on unauthorized trapping, netting, or roping bans within the corridor. Her eyes moved to Rhett. Violations will void contracts and incur fines. Rhett opened his mouth, then shut it. Numbers were running behind his eyes. They didn't add up the way he'd planned. A hand rose near the aisle. Mrs. Valdez from the diner, apron still on under a winter coat. "Who keeps watch?" she asked. "Who's out there at dawn when the rest of us are making biscuits?" Caleb felt the room tilt toward him before his legs obeyed. He stood, hat in one hand, the other smoothing the nap of felt as if calming a skittish thing. "I can be," he said, voice not loud but steady. "I'm out there most mornings anyway. I'll text Aiden when a band's moving. Eli will know the old routes better than signs do. June can advise when a mare's lame or the herd needs space. And any rancher who wants to help, well, you know the ground under your own boots." He paused. "We're not asking for a miracle, just a chance to keep the wild from breaking itself on our fear." For a long moment, no one spoke. Fluorescence hummed. Somebody's thermos ticked as it cooled. Then Wilson put his hat back on and said, "Aye." The word sounded older than the room. Votes were voices that night, not raised hands. They came slow at first, then gathering. Aye, aye, aye. A few nays, firm, but not mean. The gavel struck. Brief had taken an hour and 23 minutes. When people stood, the chamber shifted from argument into something softer. The scrape of chairs, the small apologies town life requires when you'll see the same faces tomorrow. Rhett avoided Caleb's eye, angling toward the door with his shoulders high like a man walking into weather he hadn't expected. Marjorie exhaled the way a person does after lifting a box heavier than it looked. June reached Caleb first. "A season," she said, the words both promise and warning. "A season," he agreed. The word felt right in his mouth, measured, human, the way life used to be counted before calendars learned to nag. Eli touched the brim of his hat to Marjorie. "Leave the gate open," he said. She almost smiled. Outside, the air had turned thin and bright. Snowmelt hissed in the gutters. Aiden bounded down the steps, phone up again now that the talking part was done. "They did it," he grinned. "We did it. I'll set up the volunteer list tonight. Mrs. Valdez said she'll bring coffee to the ridge at dawn. Also, my mom says if I skip algebra to watch horses, I'm grounded. Till college." Caleb laughed, a sound with corners but no bitterness. "Tell her I'll write you a note. For zoology." Aiden's eyes widened. "For real?" "Not even a little," Caleb said. And the boy howled and ran off into the lot, the kind of joy that made strangers smile without knowing why. For a minute, they didn't leave. They stood under a sky falling into early dark, the courthouse windows turning gold as if the building had caught some sunset it couldn't keep. Traffic flowed along Court Avenue. A sign across the street blinked an ad for life insurance that did not make promises it could keep, but tried anyway. Caleb watched it once, then looked away. Tonight, for once, the important things weren't for sale. June bumped his shoulder with hers. "Tomorrow?" "Before dawn." "Bring gloves. The cloth ties freeze," she said, and he heard in her voice a life that had no room for drama, only jobs to do and mercy to apply where it fit. They parted at the curb. Eli lingered, eyes on the hill where the courthouse steps met the night. "The land remembers," he said, not as a lesson, but as a benediction. "We'll help it." Caleb drove home with the window cracked, letting Cold ride shotgun. The road felt less like a demand and more like an agreement. At the turn to his place, he stopped and cut the engine. The quiet moved in. He could hear water under ice at the ditch, the creak of cottonwood, a far-off nicker that might have been wind, might have been hope. He stood a long time with his hands on the fence, thinking of a corridor that existed now not just in his mind, but in county minutes and cheap paper, and the memory of a room full of neighbors who had chosen for a season to leave a door open. He slept light and well, the kind of sleep that comes when a plan has a place to live. And before the sun broke clean over the Steens, he was up with thermos and gloves, stepping into a morning that tasted of frost and fresh chances, ready to meet the valley where it moved. When the first band drifted toward the Narrows, he was already on the rise, breath pluming. He lifted his hand, palm open to the cold, and waited for the day to carry its weight the way a horse carries a rider it has learned to trust. The first true heat of summer came like a held breath finally released. The grass crisped at its edges, sage leaves curled gray, and the streams shrank until their stones glared white in the sun. Caleb felt it in his bones before he saw it, the valley tightening, each day harder than the one before. He carried water out to the ridge with June, thermoses and plastic barrels rattling in the bed of his truck, every gallon precious. The corridor they had marked in spring still fluttered with bright strips of cloth, now faded by sun, but the bands followed it faithfully. Salt blocks drew them down from the higher hills where forage was failing. Caleb watched them file through, mares ribby from nursing, colts kicking dust, with legs too long for their bodies, and always Ashfall, proud even in hunger, scar shining dark on his shoulder. Volunteers came in shifts. Aidan biked up from town with his phone tucked away, sleeves rolled, hauling buckets as if they weighed nothing. Mrs. Valdez kept her promise, showing with a coffee urn at dawn, her apron dusted with flour. Even Wilson, who had once argued for tighter fences, now fixed gates when they sagged, his cattleman's hands steady as he looped wire. The corridor became more than experiment. It was ritual, something neighbors built together because it felt truer than steel. Still, the dry season tested them. Caleb walked the pasture one afternoon and found a mare trembling at the salt, eyes glassy with thirst. He poured water from his own canteen, enough to wet her lips, then stepped back as Ashfall pressed close, guarding but not threatening. The stallion's eyes found his, and Caleb nodded, a silent pact that went both ways. I will keep watch, and you will let me. Nights grew restless. Wind carried the faint scent of distant fire, and the stars looked sharp enough to cut. Caleb lay awake on the porch, journal open, writing fewer words than he meant, but more than he used to. Dry season always comes, but this time, I am not alone. June worked late in her mobile clinic, tending calves and colts alike, but she came by whenever she could. Once she arrived with bandages for a young filly scraped raw on basalt. Caleb held the trembling animal steady, while June's hands moved quick and sure. The filly flinched, but stayed. When they stepped back, Ashfall circled once, then lowered his head, as if acknowledging the strange partnership. Aidan caught it on camera, but this time he didn't post. Some things aren't for views, he said quietly, and Caleb almost smiled. The heat deepened. Grass grew brittle, water holes shrank. Caleb found himself rationing more carefully, choosing which troughs to fill, which salt blocks to move closer to the last trickling creek. It was work that never ended, yet he felt a kind of strength in it, a steady rhythm that reminded him of farming before fire, before loss. Sweat streaked his face, Dirt caked his boots. But when the stallion appeared at dusk, breathing slow, not fleeing, Caleb felt less like a man mending fences and more like one mending himself. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Ashfall approached closer than ever before. Caleb stood still, heart hammering. The stallion lowered his head, muzzle brushing the air near Caleb's chest, breath hot against his shirt. It was not a touch, not quite, but close enough that Caleb felt it in his bones. Then Ashfall stepped back, tossed his head, and moved to join the band grazing in the brittle grass. Caleb exhaled, long and slow. In the silence that followed, he thought of Lena, of the farm they had dreamed of how he had once frozen when he most needed to act. Now, in the heart of a dry season that tested every living thing, he had found a way to keep moving. The corridor stretched quiet in the dusk, cloth strips lifting in the hot wind, salt glittering faintly. It was not a fence, not a trap. It was a promise. And in that promise, for the first time, Caleb believed he might outlast the dry season. By late summer, the air had turned harsh with dust, and evenings carried the metallic taste of storms forming far beyond the mountains. Caleb worked under that sky, sweat streaking through dirt on his shirt, building something he hadn't thought he would ever raise again. A corral. Not the kind he'd known as a boy, with gates meant to hold horses in and keep the world out, but something different. Smaller, softer, built from timber scavenged and repurposed, rails set wide enough for wind to pass through. He hammered in rhythm, the sound echoing against empty hills. The work tore his hands and stiffened his shoulders, but it steadied his mind. Every board was an act of faith, that there could be shelter without prison, safety without chains. When the final rail was set, he left the gate unlatched, swung it wide, and walked away without looking back. June came by that evening, her truck rattling with tools and water. She leaned against the fence, arms crossed. "You really think he'll walk in?" Caleb wiped his brow, eyes on the open entrance. "Not because I want him to, because he wants to." Aiden arrived not long after, dusty from the bike ride, holding a bundle of faded cloth flags. "For the posts," he said, tying one where the gate hung open, "so it doesn't look like a trap." Caleb smiled faintly, and the boy grinned, understanding more than his years should allow. As dusk fell, Ashfall appeared at the edge of the pasture, mane stirring in the hot wind. The band held back, grazing warily, but the stallion advanced step by deliberate step. Caleb stood inside the corral, hands at his sides, heart pounding. Ashfall circled first, testing the air, hooves cutting dust. Then, slowly, he crossed the threshold. His body filled the space with restless power. Caleb didn't move. He only breathed, steady, letting the stallion feel that nothing bound him but choice. Ashfall lowered his head, snorted, pawed once at the dirt floor. Then, with a flick of his tail, he turned and walked back out into the open field. Caleb's chest tightened, not with disappointment, but with awe. The stallion had entered. He had left. And the gate had never closed. Over the next days, it happened again. At dawn, Ashfall would slip into the corral, stand a while in the shade, then depart with the band. At noon, he came once, drinking from the trough Caleb had filled. At dusk, he returned long enough to brush past the gatepost where Caleb stood. Each time, the stallion chose. Each time, the gate stood open. Neighbors noticed. Wilson rode by one afternoon, tipping his hat toward the corral. "Never thought I'd see a wild one walk in and out of a man's fence. By his own will," he said. "Guess I was wrong." Caleb only nodded. The truth didn't need more words. On the 7th evening, as thunder rolled low in the distance, Ashfall stepped into the corral and lingered longer than before. Caleb stood within arm's reach now, every nerve alive. The stallion lifted his head, eyes catching the last light. Their gazes locked, and for a breathless span, Caleb thought he felt Lena's hand on his shoulder, steadying him, telling him not to freeze this time. He lifted his palm, open and empty. Ashfall's breath warmed the space between them, close enough to stir the dirt on Caleb's skin. Then the stallion snorted softly, almost like an answer, and moved out again into the gathering dark. Caleb leaned against the rail, trembling. He had not caught the horse, he had not healed the past, but something in him had shifted, like a gate swung wide after years rusted shut. That night, rain fell in sudden sheets, rattling the roof of his cabin. Caleb lay awake, listening. For the first time in years, he wasn't listening for fire or for the silence of loss. He was listening for hooves, for breath, for the sound of something wild choosing to stay. And when he closed his eyes, he dreamed not of flames but of an open gate and a stallion standing quietly inside, as if both had finally decided they belonged to the same place. Dawn spilled silver over the steens, painting the sagebrush in a quiet shimmer. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the air washed clean, cool enough that every breath felt like a gift. Caleb walked the fence line slowly, the boards damp under his hand, the open gate still swinging loose where he had left it. Beyond, the pasture spread into mist, and in that mist, shapes moved. Ashfall and his band, grazing calmly as though the world had never tried to bind them. He leaned on the rail, letting the stillness seep into him. For so long, mornings had been measured by absence, Lena's voice missing from the kitchen, fields empty, the silence of a house too wide for one man's grief. Now the silence carried a different weight. It was alive, full of breath and hooves, of cloth ties fluttering along the corridor, of neighbors stirring before sunrise to share coffee and check water troughs. June arrived just after sunup, her truck rattling with supplies. She carried a bag of bandages and a thermos of coffee, setting both on the rail beside him. "Looks like they've made up their minds," she said, nodding toward the herd. "They can leave whenever they want," Caleb replied. "That's the point," she answered, her smile small but real. She watched him a moment longer, then added, "So can you." He thought about it. About the letters from the bank still unopened on his table. About the mortgage rates he couldn't meet. The insurance he'd let lapse because paper couldn't carry what mattered most. He thought of fire, of loss, of every moment he had frozen when movement was needed. And then he looked at the stallion standing at the gate, ears flicking, watching him back. Ashfall had chosen to return, not because of walls, but because of the space left open. Aiden came cycling up, breathless, waving his phone like a flag. "The video, our last one, it's everywhere. People are calling it the Open Gate Project. Even folks outside the county are sending money for salt and water. Someone's already talking about writing legislation." His grin faltered when he saw Caleb's expression. "Sorry, I didn't mean to make it too big." Caleb chuckled softly, the sound rusty but warm. Let it be as big as it needs to. Just don't forget the work's still here, in the dirt. He nodded toward the troughs. Fill those first. Eli arrived later, staff tapping soft against the ground. He stood at the gate, touching the wood with his palm. You've done what most men never try, he said. You stayed long enough to see the land answer. The day unfolded without hurry. Volunteers drifted in, carrying feed, sharing stories, leaving behind laughter that stuck like sunlight. The band came and went through the gate, sometimes grazing close, sometimes vanishing into the hills, always free. Each time they returned, Ashfall lingered, pausing near Caleb as if checking that the man still kept his promise. As evening settled, painted in amber light, Caleb sat on the porch with June and Eli, while Aidan tossed scraps of wood into a small fire pit. The smell of smoke rose, clean and thin, nothing like the choking fire that had once destroyed everything. Caleb sipped his coffee, listening to the rhythm of hoofbeats in the distance. For the first time, he didn't wish to be anywhere else. Not to be the man he was before the fire, not to escape the valley's weight, not even to rewrite the past. He had found something steadier than all of that. The knowledge that he could move when it mattered, that he could hold a silence without being broken by it, that he could leave a gate open and trust what came through. As the last light slipped from the ridge, Ashfall appeared again at the gate. He stepped inside, calm, unhurried, the herd trailing behind. He paused near Caleb, close enough that their breaths mingled in the cool air. Caleb lifted his hand, palm open. This time, the stallion's muzzle brushed his skin, a touch no heavier than a sigh, but solid enough to anchor a man who had drifted too long. The world did not change in that instant, and yet everything did. Ashfall turned, moving back into the pasture, the herd flowing after him like water. The gate stayed open. Caleb stayed on the rail, heart steady, eyes wet. He whispered into the dusk, "I'm not leaving either." The night deepened. Stars bloomed overhead, patient and endless. And on that land, scarred by fire, healed by trust, a broken farmer and a wild stallion had chosen the same thing: to stay. And now, it's your turn. Would you have trusted the wild giant if you were in Caleb's shoes? Just drop a simple 0 if you felt the bond, or 1 if you believe freedom matters most. Your comment means more than you think. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may touch you even deeper, and you won't want to miss it.